Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we are joined by Don Dooley to discuss progressivism. What is it? Why is it such a dominant cultural force? And how to counter it? So, Don Dooley, how would you describe sort of the essence of progressivism?
I think to give an actual definition that's not pedantic, like progressivism is to strive towards progress. So you have to kind of dig in more into how is it relevant to the way people think, because a progressive itself would be almost tautological and saying they're for progress, which is a very ambiguous term. But I think the essence of progressivism is a peculiar worldview in which the social facts take precedence over world facts, and it looks at that as an ultimate teleological process towards progress.
So how does that manifest itself, this sort of view? Where does it come from? What are these, in your view, what are kind of the earliest kind of genuine progressive thinkers, something on those lines?
So, like all things, you'd have like a BC AD. So, like the BCs might come from like the Renaissance or weird early, medieval or ancient mystery culture sects. Other big names in philosophy would be like Descartes, Bacon, and stuff like that. But real, actual, factual progressivism takes place either with probably the Whig theory of history, which might be more the John the Baptist, but the real thing would take place, I think, in the mid 1840s, and it would start with, if not Hegel himself, his immediate followers, and then on the one hand, there's that continental version, and on the British, which probably developed somewhat different, but with a lot of connections, would have taken place probably with Darwin would be the big name.
Who do you think what kind of mind do you think is attracted to sort of a progressive worldview? Is there anything specific about the disposition of a progressive vis-a-vis any other sort of position?
A progressive would be definitely something more that one would call the intellectual. Or a technocrat would be used to that. A person who really likes grand theories about the world, but also a person who is very activistic at the same time. That type of mindset that's just dissatisfied, that looks for change, and is at once disappointed with traditional philosophic or spiritual answers and tries to concoct almost from a pragmatic sense and then a weird Platonic spiritual sense on the other hand. So that kind of mind.
Would you say that the progressive generally takes a materialist view of reality, or do they tend towards sort of a Gnostic spiritualism or somewhere in between?
I think they're... Oh,
go.
I would say that there are two strands of thoughts. One would be more spiritual Gnostic, and that might be something that you'd find in, like SJWs or Bolsheviks or something like that. And then the materialist, and that evolved from probably the more Hegelian tradition. And then from the British empirical tradition, you would get more materialistic views of progressivism. So it depends on their pathway. And if you look at maybe somebody in the middle on the English side, like John Stuart Mill, or even maybe Karl Marx might try to hit kind of middle ground. So there's a spectrum there. But overall, there's, I think, two differing developing traditions going on.
Which of those two would you say is most ascendant today? The sort of materialist or the spiritualist?
I think just via just as part of almost a decaying tradition. It's still probably like scientific materialism still dominates the mind, but as everybody has witnessed in the past 8 years, the SJWism has gone insane. I think there's like even like full throttle Bolshevism on the rise and stuff like that. So that's definitely gotten like it's grown in major strides in the past 8 to 10 years. But I would say officially in Anglo-American countries, scientific materialism was probably the more dominant force, and it's still probably technically, but just definitely is being seriously challenged by the other side.
You point out Hegel being an important figure here. There tends to be a distinction between the left Hegelians and the right Hegelians. It seems to be the case that the left Hegelians are the ones in ascendancy. Do you see any of the right Hegelian sort of progressive mind anywhere these days, or are they very quiet?
Right Hegelians, the left Hegelians are obviously going to be the ones you focus on most because of they've made the biggest splash. Right Hegelians are probably things that are almost tacit in people's understanding that you'll see pop up here and there. The most famous one, though, I think would be like Francis Fukuyama. Probably neocon, like various neocons have something of a right Hegelian mindset. You might see it in some reactionaries that I hear on the internet. They tend to use like Oswald Spengler, and I think they start to reason a little bit like Hegelians maybe, but it's more tacit, and you have to kind of keep your ears open for it, and it's harder to find because right Hegelianism has been, it's never been an official thing since probably right at World War I is where it ended.
Would you? Well, I suppose you could argue that I probably make the case that right Hegelianism stopped after the Second World War. If you're going to make the case that that sort of National Socialist Germany were right Hegelians, which I think is probably fair in certain respects. Do you think the general disposition of right Hegel? What would you say is the general difference between sort of like the right Hegelian view of things and the left Hegelian? Do you think they have the same sort of disposition, but they kind of focus on different aspects of reality and elevate those over others, which is why they disagree? Or do you say that whilst you said that there was a similar sort of mindset which was common to progressivism as a whole, would you say that there's any sort of difference in this general approach of sort of the right and the left Hegelians?
I think almost by definition, a right winger is, if you've ever read like Thomas Sowell's Conflict of Vision, the constrained vision versus the unconstrained vision. I think right wingers, no matter how bat crazy they are about like a race theory or whatever, they're going to necessarily have a more constrained vision than a left, like a left Hegelian would. So that's probably going to be an issue. I'm trying to think of like an ideal type of what like a right wing Hegelian might be like that would approach a left wing in just pure unconstrained, and it'd probably be some version of like, you could probably be a right wing transhumanist that, humans are disembodied beings and they eventually shed all the material stuff, which is a burden on them. That probably exists, but yeah, even there, though, they're more constrained probably by the materialistic scientific theory that they're dealing with. So I would say the right winger is almost necessarily going to be more constrained.
That's a good point. I was thinking it was a lot of the sort of reactionary right wingers tend to be perennialists, which obviously then kind of stops them being sort of progressive by definition. But yeah, I could see why. The transhumanism is an interesting link there. Tim, any comments on sort of the origin of progressivism or what progressivism is? Any comments, criticisms?
Progressivism to me is an interesting phenomena, but I'm not entirely sure what it is and what it isn't. I use it in the sort of Wittgensteinian, Hayekian, democratic consensus view of language, in the sense that, if everyone agrees that this amorphous group of people is roughly thing X, we'll call it thing X. In the same way that liberal, circa sometime in 1900, it was like some sort of small government John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill, now it's like in the United States here, it means like some Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden supporter who wants Medicare for all. I do think progressive is a term that is useful in the sense that it identifies a group of people. But one of the troubles is I think it could identify almost everyone, or at least a significant number of people, which once any word starts identifying all members of a society, you sort of get into problematic. So my question is like, who wouldn't be a progressive? Who wouldn't be a progressive? You brought up John the Baptist. Would he be a progressive or would he be a reactionary? Is someone like Hayek? Is someone like Mises? Is someone like? It's quite clear that people like Woodrow Wilson are considered progressives, although everyone knows that they're like uber race realists and all in on segregation and all sorts of other things. So there's certain ways in which even historical progressives look like reactionaries circa 2020, according to the new progressive zeitgeist. I mean, is Abraham Lincoln a progressive? Maybe Abraham Lincoln is not, but some of his cronies in his cabinet were quite clearly on the Thaddeus Stevens, the guy. I know Thomas Dorenzo doesn't like the movie Lincoln, but the guy who plays the abolitionist senator in there, is he considered progressive? I mean, most of these guys, by some standard, are vaguely progressive enough or hold certain progressive values. Would any of these historical figures count as progressives? And of course, who isn't a progressive?
Okay, so who is and who is not a progressive? So I think to get a useful definition, you have to start where actual progressive philosophy formed. So in that way, you could also, in Christianity, who is and who isn't a Christian, you couldn't say, even if they would have had influences on doctrine, Christian doctrine or whatever, like Plato is not a Christian, Zoroaster is not a Christian. Certain things past Christianity that were influenced by Christianity, say Islam or we'll just go Mormonism. Those are not Christian. There's a certain body of doctrine that goes on there. So to go back in time and to say this person had progressive or non-progressive visions, I especially way before somebody like John the Baptist, I don't think that's particularly useful. I would go more towards who did the progressives directly look at to prop up their theories, and then at that point I would say to look at more hardline philosophical theories where what epistemology are they forced to be using, and also where is I think to me the most useful way to use progressivism is to say it's their look at social facts almost being cosmic in a way in which a non-progressive would put them. So whereas if you were to say Nero might be a progressive because he had X, Y, and Z policies or X, Y, and Z thoughts, would he put that in as far as like a weird social knowledge trumping towards a teleological end? No. But you could see why people might draw from, I don't know, certain policies from, Nero or whoever. Does that answer the question or no?
It answers the question in a way. I've used the term before, but it's one of those words where if someone asked me to define it, I probably could not supply a definition. I mean, a word like libertarian, I think, like right libertarian, I think everyone knows that right libertarian is probably could quite easily be disguised as someone who basically thinks some triad of Mises, Rothbard, one of the two Friedmans, or maybe Hayek or Mill are basically correct on economic matters. That's basically the definition of libertarian. And that to me fulfills the bill of a libertarian. Progressivism to me is more amorphous. But I would argue that libertarians in a way could easily be fitted under the broader umbrella of progressivism. I mean Thomas Jefferson, for example, is a supreme fascination for me. I mean, this guy, despite all the statue terror downers, he writes, he's a supporter of the French Revolution. He writes this Adam Eve letter. He also wants to put the seal of Moses as the thing, owned slaves and had no qualms, probably no qualms of owning them. He also he was also a strong Republican, had this yeoman farmer mentality. So someone like Thomas Jefferson is a supreme fascination. If you can't cite historically, who today is an example of a progressive? Who today? So Don, who would be today an example?
Well, I think the SJWs that we talk about are, they are filled at the core with a spiritual, progressive mentality. I would say those, like a Silicon Valley technocrat is probably tacitly filled, culturally filled with progressivism, but almost certainly, by definition, a Bolshevik or a Marxist, those are progressives, because that's a right inherent with where progressivism started. It was self-consciously progressive. I don't know if they call it this anymore, but there's definitely educational methods that come from like John Dewey. Was that John Dewey? Like, that was called progressive education in America. So those kind of philosophies are progressive. Would your general run-of-the-mill Biden or Clinton be a progressive? Probably not. They're probably career politicians who just happen to be around it and know to utilize it.
Wouldn't with Biden though? And Clinton, aren't they sort of propping up a sort of a managerial system which is very technocratic? Wouldn't that be sort of archetypally progressive? I mean, a good example of this would be coronavirus comes out and everybody's enthralled with the expert, and the science, and everyone must follow the science, and we must organize society from the top down to make sure we have correct outcomes. That seems to be a very sort of technocratic approach, which, at least historically, I would think that sort of sits quite nicely with sort of 1920s progressivism. Don?
Yeah. They are, all their policies will break progressive. The only reason why I would say they're probably not pure progressives is because they're probably more pure politicians and don't think much about it, to be honest, and they know they're in a progressive background and that's just what they do. That's kind of where my mind's at with that. But yeah, they're functionally progressive.
One of the things which interests me regarding that is, one of the things that all non-anarchists, to me, in a way, are in some ways reactionary. Now, I'm willing to say Noam Chomsky or someone like that is a left libertarian, whatever a left libertarian society would look like. But in theory, I'd say Noam Chomsky or Kevin Carson are in a way non-reactionaries. But anyone who's a quote-unquote statist, anyone who assumes that there needs to be a state, to me, in a way, is already sold out, is in some technical sense, is a reactionary. Because if you're already concluding that you need a managerial state to implement doctrines of truths, to me, you're already halfway there to saying, well, certain people need to be bossed around or physically removed or re-educated, and so forth. So there is a sort of always a inherent contradiction to me when anytime a progressive politician. You're correct. I mean, and again. It's funny. The old Biden is like, he's signed all these crime bills, and the same way all these old positions, and the same way with the Marxists. The historical Marxists some of them were quite conservative in all sorts of matters. Marx is probably famously, possibly a homophobe by modern standards, although and he also made disparaging comments about certain races too. So again, I mean, to a certain degree, in which that on social comments you could pick historically, but anyone who believes there needs to be a state, sort of Hobbesian, to me already starts selling out on human nature. The ability of human. Now you could argue that, well, we can organize ourselves into a society and create this state that will get rid of the miscreants and the degenerate people or whatever. Some people use that word as cringy. Although to modern progressives, a racist or someone who goes outside during COVID is considered functionally, by the old word, degenerate. That's a fairly classic comparison you can make. So yeah, does either you? I'll ask Swithin about this. Do you think the very fact that that they think that a state is necessary in some ways sells out or undermines their view of progressivism, or is that not the case? Swithin?
I think you have in sort of pre-modern society a greater distinction of the role of the state vis-a-vis other civil institutions. I think the progressive is someone who is very much involved with more of the modern state and the state overall as a organizing body within society, whereas a pre-Hobbesian but non sort of pre-modern statist, put it that way, would go, well, we need the king to keep the peace. But kind of that's all what he is there for, is just to minimise violence. Then we've got the role of the church that's supposed to be there for moral instruction and things along those lines, and the family. I think one of the marks of progressivism is actually, oddly, individualism. I think the progressive sees everybody as atomized individuals. Well, effectively, you have a schizophrenia amongst the more modern statists and the progressive, in that you have individuals, and then you have society, or probably better, humanity as a whole. And you're basically just a member of humanity as a whole, or you're an individual. There is no sort of mediating institutions. And then they go, oh, well, yeah, individual, you can't survive on your own, and that doesn't make any sense. Oh, therefore we have to do everything at kind of the collective level and pull the levers to move people around. Now that doesn't necessarily imply sort of communism or Bolshevism necessarily, but I think that's a more sort of technocratic mindset. And back to what Don said, the progressive has a more utopian bent, that he can remold human nature to produce optimal outcomes, whereas the Hobbesian, even though I said he's sort of the state uberalis in a certain sense, is very much, well, we need to just constrain the evil inclinations of man, but as long as we do that to a sufficient degree, we can kind of leave them alone, which isn't the case if you've got a sort of a more utopian vision, because, well, there's always more to improve, and so there's more levers to pull, there's more nudges to do to get people to produce optimal decisions. So that's how I would distinguish them. Don, any thoughts on that?
Oh, I think you nailed it on the head right there with the order in which the progressive would look at society that is out of whack with just about anybody who is not a progressive. Like that ideal type would be very much a progressive, and it also, I think, shows how, that mindset really started to take place in the Renaissance, Hobbesian era, and so forth, where the state is looked at as something a lot different than pre-modern societies would happen to look at it. And the only thing I would add to that is, and these are things that you could pick up from people like Hayek, Ostrom, or Nassim Taleb, where it's the scale and the order of authorities, or I think even like Aquinas gets into that. Scale and order of authorities is totally out of whack, and the way the progressive just almost turns it upside down, or completely and utterly does not understand where like a community would take place, a culture would grow, the authority of family as a unit, or how cultures would broadly respond to, say, a old Syrian culture in Antioch in 100 AD would not look at the king the same way that you would look at a president today. It would be bizarre. It's just not in their worldview. But yeah, other than that, I think you described it pretty well as to how the progressive just totally flips the case and just kind of denatures much in the process for his vision. Yeah.
I would agree. I would agree as well that they do flip that. I mean, you get this with Thomas Paine. The world is my country, all mankind are my brethren, and to do good is my religion. Yeah, I would agree that progressives have no mediating institutions or organizations. It's sort of like which is actually interesting because certain progressives are big advocates of a one world government, which I mean, it's not really people say, oh, you're a conspiracy theory for believing that. Well, I mean, the global EU is not like that radical of idea. And this is, I mean, if you've been to a political science project, I mean, there is a general idea of giving the EU more powers. I mean, this is not like some sort of, or creating some sort of large international organization. Although, interestingly, one of the, I've been to a political science program, one of the interesting criticisms of the EU is to just, and this is sort of like a internationalist liberal criticism of the EU, is that it's actually technically just a nationalist organization. That technically, if you look at the borders of EU, they basically end somewhere in the Ural Mountains, or maybe a little west of there, and somewhere in the Caucasian Mountains. So it's actually just a sort of United States of Europe, which is actually more of a reactionary idea. I mean, some people in the alt-right in the United States or the alt support the EU. So actually, EU skepticism is not all there's some internationalist people who are critical of that. But yeah, I do think there is a sort of either atomized individuals or the whole one world government. I would largely agree with that. And again, scale matters. But this is where, and I think we discussed this a little bit on one of the other episodes. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm anarcho-libertarian in a sense is I don't see any pragmatic arguments against one world government. And this is actually I don't see any pragmatic arguments left. Enough people in the world speak English or Spanish or Mandarin. You could have in three languages. You could construct a one world government now. Constructing a one world government in 1500 would be technically impossible, considering that even the King of France couldn't reach Avignon, or not Avignon, but like Orleans. It would be hard to take a week or two journey. Now anyone can get anywhere on a Learjet, or even the Boeing, the Airbus A380. Two A380s can haul as many passengers as the Titanic, and do it quite cheaply, much cheaper than that. So I do think there's no pragmatic or cultural. Well, there are cultural arguments why it couldn't exist, but then again, culture for most progressives is sort of a reactionary, sticky thing. Well, actually, non-Western cultures are okay. You're allowed to have this. You're allowed to have this. And actually, this is where I would argue Marxism itself is just a Western idea. It's like, I mean, you get someone like Zizek saying that the only thing that Europe was good for was spreading egalitarian Marxism, which, I mean, is actually quite honest for him, which is actually why he gets called a borderline fascist by some people on the left. But I think it's true in the sense that, Marxism is created by a bunch of old white European men. I mean, at least all the founding fathers of it. Actually, and yes, founding fathers too. Very few of their intellectuals are women early on. So yeah, I do agree it totally flips it. But where it comes from, and if you ask me where it comes from, and this is actually one of my problems with maybe not this discussion, but using it, is, does it come from Christianity? Now, me and Swithin have privately discussed this many times, and Swithin will argue it's just a heresy, but it's a likely heresy. It happens a lot. You don't get this in. This is where it's interesting. If you look like take you look at where I'm trying. I don't know if I should use the more politically correct, more politically incorrect. But if you look where strong nationalism feelings are, or their strong, traditional values, air quote, it tends to be in areas outside of the West, the historical Christian West. It tends to be in areas like even Lebanese Christians are probably more in some ways conservative than Western European Christians, thanks not to being influence of the sort of direct West, but places like the Islamic countries, they are much. There's a classic meme about women, but the Islamic countries are somewhat more reactionary in this sense. They're more nationalistic. I mean that's one of the criticisms of like Saudi Arabia, for example, or like it's sort of a nationalistic state. So did Christianity create it? I'm going to ask Switham first. Now you would always say this is a heresy, but again, it just seems like a likely heresy that gets created. So where does it come from, and is Christianity a cause of it?
I think to be a progressive, you need to have a sort of linear view of the world rather than the perennialist one. So if you take a perennialist view that, you know, there's rise and fall and it's kind of cyclical, you'll never end up being a progressive because there's never a great point which you're tending towards and you will reach the goal. Because, you know, it's just like the seasons, you know, there'll be a summer for a time, but then it'll be autumn again, it'll be winter, then there'll be a rebirth again. So if you take like a classic sort of pagan view, I think that if you take the Norse mythology, that's very sort of perennialist. Ragnarok happens, but then it starts again. You know, it's very cyclical. You can't get progressivism there. Now, Christianity and Judaism are sort of have a linear view in that there is an end point of history. And we are moving towards it, although depending on which view you take in, especially Christianity, depends how you're going to get there. So if you're kind of post-millennialist, that is, Jesus comes after the millennial sort of golden age takes place because the world becomes Christianized, and then Christ then returns afterwards. There tends to be a falling off at some point, but there's this kind of golden age and then Christ returns. If you're a premillennialist, Christ comes before the millennium, things are getting worse. So whilst there's an end point to the world, as it were, it's kind of not getting better. It's kind of getting worse until Jesus comes up personally and sorts it out. So certainly under sort of post-millennial views can tend towards sort of progressivism. This is where you get kind of like the social gospel movement of the 19th century. Murray Rothbard is very clear on this. He likes the premillennialists because they're always like, oh, the world is bad, government is bad, let's just hunker down because things are going to get worse, which he liked because it meant that they weren't encouraging the government to do anything. Whereas he despised the post-millennialists because they were trying to use the state to sort of make people good, which of course meant lots of state programs. So I think that modern progressivism, in a sense, is a Christian heresy, particularly of the post-millennial view. But what it does is, if we want to use some theological jargon, it immanentizes the eschaton. It attempts to bring sort of as it were, the new heaven and new earth here on earth now. I mean, it's even more than sort of classic sort of Puritan post-millennialist view. So a lot of the Puritans said, you know, this golden age where the world will be Christianized. But the sort of post-millennial view is that no, we have the utopia here now. And to a large extent, the modern progressive, at least, doesn't believe in sort of an resurrection or an afterlife in any sort of physical or meaningful sense. So I don't think it's necessary, but I do think a linear view of history is necessary, which Christianity certainly did bring to the table culturally. Don, any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think you gave the a good general view as to why it is Christianity is a monotheistic religion is a sort of precursor to all that. But I also think you pointed out pretty well how it came through a certain point of time. I would criticize Tim's view a little bit here on, saying that, why does it only come up in, Christian countries tend not to be more nationalistic? Well, there's a lot of history that happened there. And it's also saying why, for example, Islam over time took over Christianity in the East. That's so progressive over time, won ideas or people, or was the last man standing, say, after World War I as a legitimate philosophy. So it's the empirical argument. Yeah, it's a good observation. But also in the eastern parts of Christendom to this day, you get like nationalistic Poles, Russians, Belarusians, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think, and that's 500 million Christians. So I don't think that quite holds water. They tend to be in Africa. They still tend to be pretty patriotic towards, they tend to be pretty patriotic towards their culture. It's just the West perhaps suffered a peculiar heresy. And I think Swithin, you and I were talking, because I don't know my Protestant terms all that well, that, the way you described a certain Calvinistic view, like, yeah, that's almost a direct one-to-one translation with progressivism, and with that direct translation, it also had a peculiar look at the social as an ultimate fact in a way that I don't think most Christians would, or most cultures would, and also the way they describe that the eschaton is which to those who don't know, that means like the end of times. For those who come from a more Catholic or Orthodox background, those tend to be formalized heresies. But yeah, ultimately, it is Christianity is a prerequisite to get some of those ideas going. Historically speaking, Tim, you're right on that. But as far as is it just this one-to-one translation with Christianity where it's inevitable? If you had a very progressive worldview, you might say yes. But other than that, I would say no. It's as big of a difference as Mormonism or Islam is from Christianity, but you could definitely see a relationship there.
That's fair. That's fair to say that it's not a one-to-one worldview. It to me, it's no surprise that like where are the hotbeds of it. It's all the Presbyterian and Calvinist universities set up by the historical Calvinists is where the hotbeds of a lot of these ideas come from. I mean, they're all, it's funny, even the land grant universities too. I mean, they were set up by the Lincolnians in the north too. So it's just a hotbed of them. Although interestingly, if you think about in the long run, this was the comment Russ Roberts once made regarding some Marxists which have stuck me. Some Marxists sort of believe that you're either ahead of the curve or behind the curve. You could just as easily argue, the Protestants are ahead of the curve, in the sense that they got the disease first. And that technically the East is actually just behind the curve, and that they will go through all the same things, just later and more disastrously. I mean, if you look at if you want to use birth rate, I mean, the Northern European and U.S. and British birth rates are low, but when some of these post-communist countries, if they go liberalize as well, things will go really bad quickly in a way that the storm will never pass through here. So I do agree Christianity is a predecessor, but Christianity is also probably the best critique of it as well. I mean, I don't think there's anyone who's more unprogressive than like in some ways than Reformed actual historical Calvinists, someone like R.C. Sproul or Jeff Durbin, popular internet Calvinists. I mean, I don't think there's any easy way to say they are in any meaningful sense progressive, except in some narrow sense that all Christians are progressive, if you compare them to the Emperor Nero. So yeah, I do agree that Christianity is a necessary. But then the question is why did it emerge? Why did it merge out of it? Why did progressivism only really emerge out of Christianity? I mean, again, I've yet to see a non-Western progressive. Are there any non-Western progressives that you would fairly say is there such thing as a non-Western progressive, or is this a phenomenon that really only occurs in Western Europe, the United States, and maybe at times in the Soviet Union, the historical Orthodox countries? Swithin?
Well, there are certain sort of proto-feminist figures in certain sort of Eastern countries which get a lot of play in the Western media and seem to be funded by them. Apart from that, I don't know. Although, I mean, I suppose you could say it's in the Western influence. Japan is interesting because, so for example, Japan's birth rate is so low that Abe got all husbands and wives to leave work early once to go home and talk about how they should have more children. So you could claim that Japan is sort of influence of sort of American cultural hegemony. Apart from that, I don't know it too well. But I would say I think there are strands there, but it's clearly not as developed as it is in the West. Don, any additions?
The first one's just kind of think of it as, I'm just wondering if, we're saying, why do cultures pick up, or why does it seem like some cultures are ahead or behind the curve? That might be a perspective issue just because we're tied into our own times. So it is how do people naturally respond to a dominant culture? So in olden times with Alexander the Great, people just Hellenized because that was the dominant force. So is that just sort of eye in the hurricane looking at things, and then with a progressive philosophy, it kind of expounds on it more because you find it inevitable. One, two, as far as just I kind of a question to throw back at you guys. Would you guys consider anybody like Mao or Pol Pot or the Young Turks? Why wouldn't they be considered progressive?
I'll take this. The trouble to me with Mao Zedong is interesting insofar as technically, and we actually initially just had a discussion on this. Technically, he occupies the doctrine of third worldism, which I always find is interesting. I was recently listening to a Tom Woods show, and they were talking. Lou Rock was on. They were wondering why, I think David Gordon might have been on too. They were wondering why John Rawls didn't take his distributism of philosophy nationally, and apparently David Gordon thinks that Rawls didn't do that because, he would lose the faculty. So which I think is a very self-centered, self-interested, yet correct class background analysis. So in some ways, maybe Mao Zedong is the best progressive. Although Mao Zedong, again, I somewhat stumble over the term because I view the actions of Mao Zedong maybe isn't. I don't even know if Mao Zedong had good intentions. He didn't have good consequences. At least in the immediate run, he didn't have good consequences. I mean, unless you say, well, yeah, they had to, kill a bunch of Chinese to create the current China, which that's sort of a roundabout manner. Why couldn't Chiang Kai-shek or whatever the founder of Taiwan, it seems like if he won, it would have happened. The current China would happen like now, but just even more freer. But that's a complicated historical counterfactual case. So is Mao Zedong progressive? I'm not sure. I mean, again, almost no one looks progressive, but by all manners, almost no one looks progressive in the past. I mean, they all have body counts. They all have bodies. They all have, I can't think of the phrase. They all have corpses in their closet. I mean, I skeletons in their closet. I'm not sure. Swithin, any comments on like Mao Zedong or things like that?
Mao I'd certainly consider a progressive. I think any Marxist mass has to be. He did promote third worldism, but he wanted to industrialize China as quickly as possible. He's seen as some sort of agrarian leader. He wanted to massively. I mean, he got everyone to have iron sort of works in their homes to increase the iron production so they could industrialize. He's certainly a sort of a progressivizing force. At least that's the way he saw himself. That would be the view I would take on him. Don, we've kind of gone around this topic. So why do you think progressivism, as you understand it, is the main sort of cultural force against which no one can really stand at present in the West. Why has it got to this sort of stage?
Well, as with all ideologies or ideas, true or false, it probably to some degree appeals very deeply to some people in the world. That's one, but that's probably everything. Two, I think you and I talked about this before, where it was probably the last man standing after World War I. There were a lot of spent cultural forces there. Three, as far as to why would it appeal to more modern man, it is probably has to do with the things like the rise of science, the rise of more, on the one hand, or on the other hand, the more the technological processes. Probably even something just like generic liberalism, where people view their social rights as this ultimate fact in empirical reality with all this other stuff. And it also probably also the rise of the intellectual. For some odd reason, the way he would do philosophy seems correlated like more with what we were talking about, like a Gnostic kind of philosophy, a specialized knowledge, a technical knowledge. All those things together probably contribute to that, and then also conforming, those views to, again, like science and technology and democracy all at the same time. That's probably where why it's so dominant. Oh, plus it's also, as we said before, like it came in the West. The West is alive right now. Same reason why Hellenism, may have taken over in 300 BC or whatever, because that's the force that's in front right there.
Tim, what do you think?
Yes, I would agree in a similar way that there was a lot of spent cultural forces after World War II, and the progressive gang. There were three gangs, and 3 or 4 gangs had fought a major death match, and the progressive-ish gang won. I would agree that in a certain way that all of us the whole world has been to some extent Americanized, and by Americanized it means progressivized. I would agree with that description of why other cultures adopt it. But I just remain at times I'm not sure. I have read the Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is great. The tragic versus restrained view. I largely agree with that premise. Although it's sometimes tricky to figure out who. It's sometimes to me tricky to figure out who has the tragic view / restrained view, and who has the unconstrained view. So I don't know. I don't have anything further to add here regarding progressivism. Swithin, do you have any more comments?
No, not really. I think apart from, I think it's got cultural cachet. I think because of the role of science with big S, has yielded lots of sort of material benefits. And so the optimism with which people use science to solve sort of technical problems is then seen as a good way of solving social problems. And I think as well, I think we're still very much in the post-Second World War era, and all the old historical ones are forms of governance and ideas have kind of lost their potency. And so we've sort of had a nearly 100 years of progressivism, although to what extent that will last is another question. Which leads me on to my last question, which is, Don, progressives for the last sort of post-war period onwards have pretty much won all the fights. Why is that, and how can non-progressives beat them?
It's just a moment of despair for those of us who don't quite buy the philosophy and find it pretty bad, or at least overused or overdone. And as far as beating them, I think it is. I mean, it's the sad thing of just probably digging in more intellectually and trying to uncover the truth and hoping truth wins out. and yeah, it's always in winning the battle of ideas, and that's all I got. There's not much to it, unfortunately. I'm pretty bleak on that one.
Is there anything that you think is particularly persuasive to the progressive mind that non-progressives would kind of use rhetorically to get under the skin, to get beyond their progressivism, or do they just take whatever you've got and deconstruct it and put it into the progressive timeline and then sort of absorb it and move on?
Unfortunately, one of the problems with progressive philosophy is it does resemble kind of a, this airtight cult-like philosophy that, gets bright young kids in, it says a couple true things here and there, or a couple of interesting things here and there, and then, it's fortified. But as far as winning out, I think it is essentially, again, just doing things better than them, doing things better and showing it on your own on the one hand, and then on the other, for example, what would be something that would be progressive now, which is, bizarre, would be like saying Cleopatra is black, she's Greek. But it's like just basic facts like that and stuff like that. If you do better scholarship towards truth, hopefully that's what the human mind is geared towards ultimately. But it's also probably a large detox program, unfortunately, and then hopefully that stuff wins out in the end.
Interestingly, not to play devil's advocate, but interestingly, what you basically described is something that, in some ways, I'm not sure if you would describe yourself as a reactionary, in some ways requires hope, in some ways, or some positive view of some. Well, again, you could go and deconstruct my values, but it requires some sort of positive view that the truth will win out. Which I'd not to play devil's advocate, I'd argue that's a progressive view. I mean, one of my favorite books actually is 1984. In the subtitle is The Last Man in Europe, and technically, and I like it because it's sort of a philosophical discourse, not because it has a particularly good plot. Technically ends in despair. The book ends in despair. The guy hates his wife, whatever you want to call the significant other in that book. He sells her out in room 101. So it technically ends in despair. It ends with all him going back loving Big Brother. So that's one of the interesting things. I mean, reactionaries in some ways are progressive too, in the sense that they think they can defeat this machine. And Swithin's correct. They won all the fights. And actually, what's even worse, and Michael Malice would point this out. What was even worse is Michael Malice would point that is conservatives are just progressivism. Conservatives in the United States and Britain are just progressives going this. It's just progressivism going the speed limit. So I mean that's to a certain extent how bleak the picture is. I don't have any hope in look how disastrous. The Conservative Party might have won, or Tory, I forget, won the recent election. But was liberty protected in Britain? I actually think Jeremy Corbyn would probably have been much better on coronavirus than the current president, the current prime minister. Although I don't know, I'm not 100% sure about that. He may have been much worse. But that's uber pessimism. So I do think that what gives you the hope that it can be defeated? Aren't we all just destined to keep going down the rabbit hole? Swithin or Don, any comments on that?
Yeah, I'm a little so it seems I'm wondering if your framework of I think it's because of your really, really broad view of what a progressive is, and it almost seems like you're saying too, like, say you're a general in a battle, and you still think, or a athlete, you plan to win, or there's goal orientation there. I'm wondering if you're confusing any goal orientation with a progressive. Is that what? Because I almost interpret your worldview as that. Is that kind of what you're saying?
That's fair insofar as I think that do you have that's why I said it's sometimes hard to figure out. I've read Thomas Sowell's book on constrained and unconstrained, but it's sometimes hard to figure out, because some like paleocons will point out, paleocons, for example, will point out that Rothbard is in some ways a utopian. Who think, they will point out that libertarianism is a utopian, because what we need is a state. We need a state too. And minarchist libertarians are some of the best statists, technically, because they'll just defend a limited state. So my point is that sometimes it's hard to figure out who really has the constrained and unconstrained view. I don't mean to be over. I do think definitions of words matter. I'm willing to use progressive in the colloquial sense. I use that myself. I use it myself. But there's lots of words that have colloquial definitions. But do you have a goal? And doesn't that make you, in some ways, a progressive too? I mean, again, the machine has won all battles, as Swithin pointed out, and you're quite bleak. So maybe I am just have an overly broad definition, but you have cut some of them out, but you haven't cut them all out of my overly broad definition. So sorry, I might be that way, but I.
What if you say, maybe this is again, and it's kind of a where you could see how a dialogue would be much in favor of a progressive versus a reactionary, and why somebody would be on this very false dichotomy. Say it is your goal to be, you love archaeology, you are doing archaeology or history for its own sake, and you come up with the fact that Cleopatra was a Greek. And then all of a sudden a progressive comes in and it's this very articulate, rationalized dialogue saying that, no, she was black because social facts dictate that. And then you are all of a sudden, engaged in a battle that came kind of out of nowhere. I don't think that makes you a reactionary. I think that makes you engaged in other processes, other thoughts, other directions that are completely contra to the progressive, but the way the progressive has a worldview, looks at institutions, and dictates articulate, rationalized dialogue, it puts people automatically on a back foot. So when you look at facts, social knowledge, truth in that way, you're not really being a reactionary, but you can understand how articulate knowledge and rational knowledge puts you on a back pedal, and then all of a sudden you are arguing almost like maybe a Burke or Hayek or whoever, where all this other stuff come, or maybe even Mises' calculation argument might be something like that, where you have to actually articulate why the heck they're just kind of bizarre.
One of the criticisms, for example, of Hoppe is that he took his argumentation ethics from like the king of the Frankfurt School, Habermas. This was made in a. This was made. This is one of the. This, you want to go deep into the weeds of like, and so the best right libertarian, is technically some technical follower of the Frankfurt School. And I'm ambiguous about that. I'm ambiguous about that. The best. In some ways, if you can't beat them, join them, and join them and do it better. I mean. Aren't by definition arguing is in a way a progressive idea? I just think that in some ways we're all progressive. It could be that I have a narrow worldview in the sense that I can't escape my worldview, but I'm also suspicious that other people can escape it either. That's what I'm also suspicious of as well. So do you people do walk away from the Democratic Party. The people do fall away from the most radical things. 10 years ago, I was much more. I was a progressive in some sense. Not very long, not very thoughtfully. Look at now. I'm much more different than I was 10 years ago. So I'm not entirely sure. So do you think arguing, for example, makes one a progressive? Do you think that makes it? Because you go back to the Protestant Revolution, this is what a lot of the reactionaries complain about. A lot of reactionaries say, well, if you give everyone the Bible, you'll get you'll get lunacy. And actually, ceteris paribus, in 400 years, we did get lunacy. It just took a long time. Now, again, they'll say heresy. So is knowledge itself and arguing a kind of progressive a thing? Because you say the truth will win out. That to me strikes as very progressive oriented and not circular. If you want to say, well, the truth will win out, then there'll be tyranny, then there'll be truth, then there'll be tyranny. That's a sort of circular worldview. That's fine. If you want to say, well, everything is just going to be bleak, I mean, that's also fine. But you still seem to have a goal of somewhere to go. I mean,
well,
John?
I'm sorry. So again, if my goals are more mundane or parochial, say to write the best, history in the world, then all of a sudden you get, politically correct Bolshevik, the party line. But to say that the truth will win out, no. I said you should probably go hoping for it, and that's more ethical disposition too. And I would say, so a progressive worldview, I think they're going to be married, almost married. It'd be kind of interesting to dissect it a bit more, but like utilitarian ethics, which have very much taken over philosophical books and so forth. But they're
all terrible, and they're all terrible and incoherent. I mean, utilitarianism to me is incoherent. Like, why don't we just kill a baby why don't we just kill a bunch of people with headaches to test them? I mean, it will save. I mean, they're incoherent in my view. But
right. But the worldview itself is saying, you as a person, in order to function at your best to where you want to be, your ethical view or your view of looking at man to man or so on and so forth, it's not going to probably have the ethical view of man and society in a way of progress. So when I would say like hope for victory, is a mother going to be, fighting for her dying child who's, being attacked by a bear or whatever, no matter how hopeless it is? If that mother's fighting, that's an act of hope. But it's not for her to despair on it. I think one would look down on her for her to just throw the baby at the bear or whatever. So these are tied in with you, your action, your disposition, and not sinking into things like despair. It's not so much being so concerned with the end results as much as what you are doing for yourself, for your faith, culture, your look at truth, and so on and so forth. But it's a different orientation, I think, that's required, and it is a different orientation most have until they would get railroaded by something like an ideology like progressivism, where, again, I want to say that a locomotion obeys these laws in order for it to work, and if a progressive came around and said, no, that is not a locomotion is a table because of social necessity, that person, where's he at that point?
I don't, as far as the sort of hackneyed, the hackneyed people that show up and heckle people, I mean, I view them as a menace. I view them as a menace. I don't have any direct solutions to deal with them. But I don't think it's a direct road to a gulag either. I do think there is a sort of, they always use the first they came for the such and such. They use it about the right wing, but it could just as easily apply to the left wing. I'm well aware of that. But you do have some hope in there, in the sense that you think that truth should win out, or you should act toward the truth, which to me, in a narrow sense, makes you at least somewhat of a progressive. I don't see that as a bad thing. Do you think being a progressive is a bad thing, in the sense that it leads to harm to yourself, or see, I don't even know how to describe it in a way that isn't by definition progressive, based on the term, what we perceive to be the terms of the agreement. I mean, the problem with the Overton windows and blind spots is you can't really see what's not in the Overton window until someone else moves it. I mean, I'm not against having small goals. I'm all for small goals. But I would say the reactionary project of overthrowing progressivism is itself a grand goal, considering success. I mean, it's been extremely successful. And actually, the last person who tried to defeat it is the most hated man in history. Whether or not that's correct or not, I mean, I don't want to open that can of worms. But the last person who tried to take it on head on lost quite miserably, and found his own country occupied in two. It would have probably been better for his own country that he would got shot when he was 28 or 26. Hindenburg or some other character, much better for everyone involved, in particularly the Germans themselves. So I view defeating progressivism with the cap like isn't it just a person isn't just pulling away one person at a time. It's not some grand project, which is fine. But I don't see any large institute, like I don't see you can create some anti-progressive institution. Like, I mean, there's a sort of internet rule that all institutions will become left-wing unless they're explicitly not. That's sort of the Michael Malice dictum in action. They'll all become just like Yale University. Started out as a Calvinist or Presbyterian, now today it's full of lunatics. I mean, I don't mean to be overly critical. I'm just
No. This is
view the thing as I view it. Don?
Yeah, in a way, I would agree that. So if you have the ideal type progressive, which we won't talk about, but I probably should have mentioned, like, this is an ideal type. But like if you have the ideal type reactionary, all that guy is a literally what do they call that? Like the horseshoe theory of just almost an idealist guy just hating progressives. And he would automatically have a grand scheme and become absolutely, almost indistinguishable in methods and or at least results. But yeah, that's that. In that regard, it's sure. But so for me, like, let's say if I am a progressive or not, you should be rather apathetic about it. But what would make me say not a progressive is, like, I do not equate railroads with women's rights. Like they've almost got nothing. Like, it's almost a random development to me. Nor do I. They're not necessarily linked. That would be like maybe a more modern progressive thought. They might both be good, but they're in no way part of a grand theory. Nor would women's rights change how to build a railroad. So yeah.
Okay. Swithin, any final comments?
I would say, Tim, I think your approach to progressivism, I can see why you would call everybody a progressive in a certain sense. Although I do think there is sort of clear subsets of sort of progressivism. If you say a progressive is someone who has a sort of linear view of history, say all those are progressive, fine. I do think there are certainly different types within that camp which are very distinct. You also seem to make the argument that Mr. Adolf Hitler was an anti-progressive, and I actually think he was one, in a sense. He was a right Hegelian. The manifest destiny of the German people. So he had very much a teleological view and sort of a linear view. Now, he may have had a perennialist view. I'm not sure on that, but he certainly had sort of like a destiny the German peoples were to have one country, one people, one nation, one leader. So I would say that he is kind of progressive. So I suppose in that sense, so the question I possibly could have done to narrow it down is, how do you defeat sort of the left Hegelian progressives? And William had a very Don had a very sort of downbeat response, and you just kind of keep fighting and hopefully you'll win. I think with the progressives, twofold. Firstly is, depending how the economy goes over the next 20 years, which may not do too well, considering coronavirus and mental monetary practices, that could well dampen sort of technocratic views of social engineering because they will have seemed to have been failed, and so something else will rise. Although to what extent that might be progressive itself is another question, though it might. Another way I think to undermine progressivism is to rhetorically get things on a more sort of personal and local level. It's like, okay, what would be good for you to do? You know, is it going to be good for you to go and blame everybody else because somehow you are in the oppressed class? Is this going to be a good way for you to have good sort of mental stability, and are you going to be able to hold down a job? Are you going to be able to be a productive member of society if you go around thinking everyone secretly hates me and looking for all opportunities to be play the oppressed card? Well, I suppose that might pay off in the current age to some extent, but I don't think it takes too much thought to think that's probably not going to be the best mindset to have if you kind of want to have like a reasonable and enjoyable existence. So I would take it into that respect. And then the other way, I think, as Sean Gabb has pointed out, you want to try and get sort of non-progressives to be create sort of cultural works, probably more but novels than anything else, just because they're the cheapest. Although producing sort of TV and video is much cheaper now than it used to be. But to create a comparable quality in principle in a book is much cheaper. So I think that's one thing. And then, of course, get your kids, if you have any, out of public schooling, and even a lot of private schooling for that matter, because they just sort of versions of public schools would help. And I think that would work. I think actually the creation of sort of the non-progressive institution, whilst it might end up being progressive eventually, is probably a way forward. You need a separate space, a safe space, as it were. Although it's not really a safe space in the same sense, but you need a space in which different non-progressives can get together and sort of sharpen each other's toolbox and come up with best ideas and create some good cultural works out of there. So similar to Mencius Moberg's anti-versity idea, although not necessarily being used as the way to bring in the new sort of monarchical future under the Mobergian position. Any final thoughts, Don or Tim?
Yeah, I think your solutions are probably much more optimistic than mine, and I think too you could also say faith in the natural things that progressives subvert. They can only subvert so much before they start to, like the family or something like that. You could do lots of damage for generations, but it can only last so long. And the natural instincts it tries to suppress, the natural human reasons or virtues or whatever, it can only get so out of whack. But yeah, that's all. Nice talking to you both.
Yes, it was nice talking to you both. I mean, the only two quick comments. I mean, one option is that one interesting option is that actually technically no one is a progressive. I mean, everyone's a regional thinker. Everyone's quite parochial, and that actually no one is a progressive. That's the other option that is completely plausible that runs through my head when people use the term progressive. That technically, someone like Mao Zedong or Woodrow Wilson or even that guy from Germany, they're actually all just nationalists of some kind. Woodrow Wilson's American nationalist. And that's just slightly bigger. So one option is actually everyone's just a self-interested parochial thing, and we actually can't get over it. And actually another word for optimism or pessimism, by the way, is a book like, The Fundamentalist Shall Inherit the Earth. Now the book's actually interestingly written by a liberal of some variety. But the premise of the book is exactly that. The societies that are quote unquote more traditional have more kids, and the societies that don't. I mean, if you want to defeat it, then that's numbers strategy. But yeah, great talking to both of you, and I enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for listening, and thank you, Don, for joining us. If you've enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends and family, and please subscribe to us on Podbean, on YouTube, and on Spotify. And if you'd like to contact the show with any ideas or any comments, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.